I'm Maria Noel Groves, clinical herbalist and owner of Wintergreen Botanicals in New Hampshire. Today we're going to make a different kind of herbal oil than you may have made before. This is an alcohol-intermediary oil, and it's a technique that you can do with dried herbs. It's really handy to do, at the end of the season or in the winter time where you don't have some of the fresh herbs available. But I actually feel that compared to some of the more traditional oils, this one tends to keep a lot better because it's somewhat disinfected by the alcohol, and you're using dried herbs as opposed to fresh. And it makes a surprisingly good extract. The herbal oils tend to come out very vividly colored. My guess is partly because the little bit of alcohol that we use helps to extract some of the pigments, and I'm guessing also a lot of the other more alcohol soluble constituents of the plant that are not necessarily as oil soluble. Oils are really handy because you can use them in a lot of topical remedies. It's very soothing to the skin, but unfortunately oil is not really a very good solvent, and so this is where the alcohol comes in. And another advantage to this technique is that you're done within 24 hours and you make a very nice oil. There are some other techniques that only take a short span of time using a heat method. Only takes maybe a couple hours to a day or two, so that's also a really nice technique, but this is one that you can try as well, and you'll be really surprised with the results. So this one does involve a little bit of prep, and what we're basically going to be doing is grinding up the dried herb. Today we're going to use gotu kola, which is a great skin healing herb, and we're going to grind it up into sort of a coarse, not exactly a powder, but somewhat powder, and then we're going to add a little bit of alcohol. So I'm going to weigh, a blender is really handy to do this in. You can use other grinding materials that you might have or mechanisms that you have, but we're going to use a blender later on, so you'll have less cleaning to do if you weigh it in the blender and grind it in the blender. So I'm going to actually make a double batch. Usually you would do 1 ounce of herb, but we're going to do a double batch because I really like gotu kola, so we're going to start with 2 ounces. Sometimes with really fluffy herbs, like if you do this with dried calendula, it's really hard to grind if you have a lot. They just kind of poof up in the blender. So for that, I might do them in like 1/2 ounce batches, but gotu kola should grind up pretty easily. So I'm just going to do the whole 2 ounces, and I'm just weighing it out on the scale. So almost there. And you can just use, an inexpensive kitchen scale from the department store, but it may not measure perfectly exactly, but as my teacher Michael Moore would say, this isn't lab science, it's herbology. And this is actually a technique that I learned from Michael Moore. And we were all very skeptical at first when he told us about this technique, and then we were extremely impressed with the final results. So there we go. We have 2 ounces of dried gotu kola, and this, I was very excited. This is the best looking gotu kola I've ever gotten. Mountain Rose had just got it in stock, and it's a really nice bright green, much brighter green than I usually see gotu kola. So this next part is kind of noisy. We're going to grind it up until it's about a coarse powder, and usually I say, when we have a dance in the blender or a party in the blender, everything will be really fluffing around once it gets to about the right stage. So bear with me. The dust settle for a minute, and then you can pour it out into your container. And I like something with kind of a wide base on this, just because it helps to stir the alcohol in a little bit better. So Pyrex containers work really well. You can use like a wide mouth mason jar, but you might find that it's just a little bit harder to get it around the edges. The dry chunks can kind of tend to stay in, and so this is just coarsely ground. There's still some slightly longer pieces, but that's fine. It doesn't have to be a perfect powder. We're just trying to create as much surface material as possible, so that it can come in contact, because you'll see in day 2 when we actually make the oil itself that the herb and the oil are only together for a really short span of time. It's kind of amazing that this technique even works at all with the short time, and it's all because of the alcohol. I've tried doing the same technique without the alcohol, and the herbs just don't seem to retain the medicinal properties that they would with the alcohol, which isn't surprising, but I did test it out. So now we're going to add the alcohol. You add, for every 1 ounce of herb, you would add a ½ ounce of alcohol. I use whole grain alcohol, but if you don't have that available, I've tested it out with vodka, and that seems to work just fine as well. Same parts, you know, for every 1 part or 1 ounce of herb, you would add a ½ ounce by volume of the alcohol. And if you have it, then I would say use 100 proof vodka, but if you don't have it, I mean, you only might need a ½ ounce. No need going out to buy 100 proof vodka for that, so you can use whatever you have on hand. Like I said before, Michael Moore often said, and I often say as well, this isn't lab science, it's herbology, and a lot of times you can just fudge it. So I'm doing a double batch, so I have 2 ounces here, so I'm going to do a whole ounce of the alcohol. And so it just kind of mixes in there, and then I'm just going to kind of use a fork. Sometimes I'll just put the lid on and shake it around just to evenly distribute the alcohol throughout the herb. And this is going to just kind of prep it. So the idea of the alcohol is, the main purpose is that it kind of pre-digests the constituents in the herbs. It helps release them from the herb to make them much more readily available to the oil later on. And I also suspect one of the advantages is that it also kind of disinfects the herb, which is handy as far as herbal oil longevity goes. One of the downsides to herbal oils is that oil is, 1, not a great solvent. The alcohol helps with that. And then 2, oil is also really not a great preservative. Things tend to go bad really easily. If there's something that people tend to have issues with going off, it's usually the herbal oils. And so we're avoiding a lot of those by, you know, 1, using dried plant instead of fresh. Fresh has its advantages, and there are some herbs like St. John's wort that I would probably only do fresh. But for things that could be done fresh or dry, this is a good technique to do. So using the dry reduces the chances of it going bad, and then using this alcohol method also seems to help. So now everything's really nicely mixed in. And I'm just going to put the lid on. You want a relatively tight sealing lid. I'm going to give it a couple extra shakes just to help distribute that alcohol through. And there's no need at this stage in the game to wash out your blender. It's got some herb dust in it, but we're going to use it tomorrow. We're going to pour this right back into the jar or into the blender, and then we're going to add our oil and blend it together, and that's usually when I clean it, is after that fact. So we'll see you tomorrow when we actually make and strain our herbal oil, and you'll get to see how lovely green it is and how nice and healing. So we're back. It is about 24 hours later, and we're ready to do step 2 of our alcohol-intermediary herbal oil. So if you remember from before, we have our go-to cola that's been ground. I'm doing a double batch, so I have 2 ounces of ground dried go-to cola and 1 ounce of the organic alcohol to go into it to kind of pre-digest it so that it will come out really easily when it gets combined with the actual oil. If you were doing a regular batch, it would be 1 ounce herb, ½ ounce of alcohol, and then 7 ounces of olive oil. But since I'm doing a double batch, I'll be doing about 14 ounces. And as you remember, this isn't lab science, it's herbology, so I'm probably going to do closer to 16 ounces just to make it a round, easy number for bottling. But you can really make it up, you know, it's up to you. You can play around with that quite a bit. Another thing that you can play around with is how long your herb hangs out with the alcohol. If you're in a real rush, you could do it for just a couple hours. I find that probably about 24 to 48 hours works a little bit better. And then there are days where I just can't get back to it right away, and so I might even wait 1 week, 2 weeks. The longer you wait, you run the risk of the alcohol drying out and then being slightly less useful. But you can still make an oil with it, and it's useful when you're done to label your product accordingly to how long it sat, and just kind of see which remedies work better for you. If, as years go by, you might have a couple different batches of, say, calendula oil or go-to cola oil or whatever, and you can take note of which ones seem to work the best and what techniques you used for it, how long you let it sit, and see if you can make a more reliable batch in the future going with the ones that worked a little better. So it's just something fun to kind of play around with. So now we're ready. This part's pretty easy. It is really noisy, so I am going to turn us off and back on again so you don't have to sit here for 5-10 minutes listening to this thing whir away and nothing else. But we are going to put our herb and our alcohol. back in to our blender. I didn't bother cleaning it because we were just going to put the herb back in. So it's the same blender we ground our herb in. And then we're going to add our olive oil. And you could use a different olive oil or a different oil. If you don't want to use the olive oil, you could use really almost any kind of oil as long as it's somewhat healing in its properties and has a decent shelf life. If you wanted to use, say, almond oil, just know that that one tends to go rancid a little bit more easily, and it also can cause allergic reactions for some people. But popular ones include, besides olive oil, of course, you can also work with grapeseed oil. That one sometimes goes rancid a little bit more quickly, but it still lasts a decent amount of time, and some herbalists really like it. Coconut oil, that one's solid at room temperature, but you could easily melt it down. That one's a good one to work with in the heat of summer because if it's a really hot day out, coconut oil will be liquid, and that'll make it a lot easier to work with and to extract with. And you could also work with sesame oil, especially if you were doing more of an Ayurvedic preparation, an untoasted, unrefined sesame oil. Or sometimes sesame oil has a little bit of sun protective property to help with maybe like a 2 or a 4 SPF. I don't have an exact number, but it does have a little bit of sun protective factor to it. So if you're making something that you're going to put on your skin in the summertime, you might want to do it in sesame oil. Just know that some people are sensitive to sesame, and people can be sensitive to anything, but it's more apt to happen with something like sesame oil or with almond oil. So I am going to put this on the scale and zero it out. You can weigh your oil to measure it, or you can use a measuring cup. Not everything has the same weight and volume, but oils and beeswax actually do, so that makes it really handy. So you just use whatever is more convenient for you. And if I was doing a regular batch, I'd add 7 ounces. Since this is a double batch, we're going to do about 14, maybe fudge it and make it about 16. And so we'll just pour that right into the blender. Glug, 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 glug. If you wanted to do it in the opposite way, granted, keep in mind that most of our kitchen measuring equipment isn't exact, but it doesn't really need to be exact to make good herbal medicine, but you can also use the measurements that are on the side of your blender. If you didn't put the herb in first, you could put the olive oil in first and then add your herb, and you'd be all set to go. So we're almost there. Yeah, we'll make it 16. So now I am going to work on blending this, and I usually start kind of low. Make sure that you have a lid on because this could get awfully messy if you didn't. And then kind of work your way slowly up the dial to one of the higher ones, and just let it keep blending until the blender gets warm, which usually takes about 5 minutes. You could let it go longer. This is a really good way to kill blenders, so just be aware that if you do this frequently, you might have to replace your blender every now and then. The other thing that I am going to do while this is doing its thing is I am going to take what I'm going to strain it through. This is the same kind of method you would use for straining just about anything. I've got a cup to hold the finished strained product. I've got a strainer, and then I'm going to cut up a couple pieces of cheesecloth and layer it so that I can actually squeeze by hand as much as possible. So I'm going to do that while this is blending, and then when you come back, you'll see me squeezing things. Okay, we're finally there. The blender is warm to the touch, just lukewarm. It's not going to be hot or scalding or anything like that. And usually about 5 to 10 minutes is a good time frame to do this. And so then you take the lid off. We're just going to pour it through our strainer, and you can see here I just cut my cheesecloth and I took it off the roll, so it's already a couple layered off the roll, and took 2 of those chunks and I just sort of layer them over the strainer, and that way I can pour it through and then squeeze everything out. If I was doing a tincture or a syrup or something like that that washes out relatively easily, it might stain but otherwise washes out, I might use something that's more reusable, something that's not too absorbent, like an old cloth napkin or an old dishcloth. I actually have nylon jelly bag, and I have another nylon cloth that I use, and those work really well. I can just throw them in the laundry. But for herbal oils, once these get oil on them, they really never wash out. It just gets rancid and gross. So I'll use cheesecloth And while some people do reuse the cheesecloth, usually I just toss it out at that point because it is kind of gross and messy and it never really cleans out. So we're just going to pour it through. Cheesecloth is oddly kind of hard to find. So I usually get it at the local natural food store. I'm there pretty frequently, so it's easy enough for me to pick up. But I was surprised one day on my way to class down in Nashua, I realized I had forgotten my cheesecloth and was driving around this mecca of strip malls and hardware stores and grocery stores and craft stores, and I could not find cheesecloth. It's apparently not that common in conventional stores. So sometimes if you go to more of an old-fashioned local hardware store, they might have it with their canning equipment, something like an Aubuchon or just even a neighborhood one that's not not the really big ones. In season, they're more available. In season for canning season, you might find more cheesecloth around. And it's kind of hit or miss, but I find that the natural food stores usually have cheesecloth hanging out in their kind of cleaning section, and it's not too expensive. I get an unbleached one, and I also get my coffee filters unbleached from the local natural food store. But you can use regular, you can use bleached if that's all you can find. So we're just kind of pour this through. It's actually, I've got quite a bit here, so it's going to take a little while. Still have a little bit of dregs left. And the trick with straining out herbal oils is that you usually have quite a bit of herb dust, especially with this technique, because we're grinding up our herbs to close to a powder. There's a lot of herb material that's going to work its way through this coffee filter and get into the final oil. And that's not necessarily terrible, but it does give a gritty texture to some of your products, especially if you're making it with the bottom, the oil at the bottom of the jar. And it also makes it a little bit harder to tell if your oil has gone bad, which doesn't tend to happen too often with this technique. We discussed that earlier. But if your oil gets moldy, or especially if it gets kind of yeasty, moldy, it might get cloudy. And if you have a lot of herb dust in the jar, it might be really hard to tell, is it just the herb dust or has it actually gone bad? So what I tend to do, both for just texture and then also so that I can monitor my oils a little bit better, is I'll do a second filtering through a coffee filter. You really have to do the first filtering through something that you can squeeze. A coffee filter is one not porous enough to get a lot of your material. It'll clog up really easily. So you want to use something that you can really squeeze everything. Plus, it's really not very strong. So if you did try to squeeze your coffee filter, it would just break and make a huge mess. So you kind of have to do this first straining through a regular piece of cloth or cheesecloth, and then if you want to, you can do it again through this. You could also just let your oil sit for a little while, let the dust settle out, pour off what's on the top, and kind of leave it at that, and not worry too much about the little bit of oil that got left behind in the herb dust. It really is totally up to you. So that's pretty much the rest of our herb. And so we're just going to squeeze that out. Try to make sure that not too much kind of oozes out the sides, because you want to get it as filtered as possible. It'll make life easier for the second straining. The second straining through a coffee filter can actually take several hours, and you may even need to change the coffee filter periodically as it gets clogged up. So usually that's a good thing to have it do while you're doing something, something elsewhere in the kitchen or elsewhere in the house, and just kind of check on it periodically. I'll usually put like a plastic bag or a paper towel over it, just to make sure that nothing really falls into it while it's straining out for that second one. But this part goes pretty quickly because you're using your hand power. If you're doing something that stains, like maybe turmeric, it's not a bad idea to take your rings off first. I hand strained some turmeric once years ago, and it took several weeks before my wedding ring returned to a normal color. So my husband was a little anxious about that. But chlorophyll washes out relatively easily, so I'm not too worried about it. And I don't know if you can see it very well on here, but this is an amazing shade of green. It's just really impressive. I mean, definitely from looking at this, I can tell that alcohol is very good at pulling the chlorophyll out of an herbal oil. And I'm always just really proud of how colorful my herbal oils come out. And I'm surprised sometimes when I'm in the marketplace and I see salves or I see herbal oils and they don't really have any color to them. And You know, I know part of it's because I'm using the alcohol as an intermediary, but you can get good color even from, you know, more typical herbal oils. And to me, color is one of the indicators that you're getting some good stuff out of your herb. And while it's not the absolute, it is kind of a handy thing. And this is just really, really, really green. It's pretty amazing. And so I'm going to strain it through a second time. And like I said, this will take a little bit longer. Just kind of pour it off into here. And you'll find that some herbs leave more dust than others. I'm sure part of it has to do with how well it's ground. There are probably other factors too. As much as I'm not a fan of paper towels, I will say they are handy for cleaning up herbal oil stuff. What I tend to do for the ultimate cleanup is I'll wipe everything down as much as possible with paper towel just to get the excess oil off, and then I usually just throw it in the dishwasher. If you don't have a dishwasher or you don't like dishwashers, you can just use really hot soapy water. I will say that using more conventional soaps tend to work better than your really all natural soaps, but if you put some good elbow grease and wash it a few times, you can probably get it off with the more natural soaps too. So I'm just going to then put it through the coffee filter, and this will take a while. You'll probably be able to see there that it drips through very, very slowly. And if you notice that it's dripping through not at all, if it clogs up, what you can do, sometimes you can just sort of shift this around, or you can very carefully pull out a new coffee filter, pour into your new coffee filter, and then put a new one in. So sometimes I'll go through a couple coffee filters, especially for this where I've got a double batch of oil. Once it's all done, I can pour it into a dark glass jar, store it in a cool, dark, dry spot. Most of these herbal oils should keep for at least a year, and I find that with this method, oftentimes they'll keep even longer than that. Your two big enemies are rancidity and microbes, and because we are using dry material, you want to use, you know, nice, fresh, new olive oil that lasts a long time. I use organic extra virgin. And because of the alcohol, that tends to fight off both of those things relatively well. Also, keeping it in that cool, dark, dry spot really does a good job at helping to keep things from going rancid. And I very rarely end up with an oil that goes rancid within 1 to 2 years. But I would make batches that might last you 6 to 12 months, especially if you're using some of the more traditional techniques. And I do want to talk real briefly about the traditional techniques, but we'll probably make some more videos that actually shows you those techniques. So one really classic technique is kind of like a tincture, where you just chop up your herb. You can use fresh or dry material, put it loosely, pack it in your jar, cover it with your olive oil. There's no alcohol with any of these other methods. You just use herbs and oil. Cover it with your oil and then put a lid on it. Let it sit in a sunny spot, a warm spot for about 1 to 2 weeks, ideally about 2 weeks, and shake it regularly or stir it regularly so that anything that floats to the top has a chance to get remixed in. If it floats to the top, it might mold on you. And you can do that for about 2 weeks and then strain it out through the same method. If you're using fresh material, then you may want to use just a layer of cheesecloth as a cover as opposed to putting an actual lid on it. And the idea of the cheesecloth is it gives it a little bit of protection so nothing gets in there, but it allows the moisture to evaporate out as it sits. You still want to be very, very attentive to stirring it at least every day, because things will get kind of funky if they're allowed to sit on the top, and then your oil is going to go bad. If it's a dry material, it's less crucial. You can just leave the lid on. Having that little bit of warmth from a sunny windowsill, or maybe putting it in the oven with the pilot light on, something like that definitely helps extract the herbal oil a little bit better. You have to be careful with heat, because heat can also do the opposite. It can make your oil oxidize, kind of like it's going rancid almost, but more quickly if you use too high heat. But if it's something that's kind of in that moderate range of like 90 to 100 degrees, and it's just for a short period of time, then it usually works pretty well. So you can also use, if you've got like a good dehydrator or a yogurt maker, you can use that. If it's a warm-ish sunny day and you want to put it in your car, you can do that. Your herbal oil might leak out, and the car method's probably not the best method to use if you don't have an actual lid on it, because that really is going to make a big mess in your car. With these herbs, when you're making herbal oils, it really is a good idea to let it sit no more than 2 weeks. If you let it sit for longer than 2 weeks, there's a higher chance of it going bad, especially if you're working with fresh plants. When you're straining out fresh plants too, if you notice that there is a little bit of water left, you can either kind of let that settle out and pour off, decant off, because you don't want that more watery substance. It's going to make your oil go bad more easily. Or you can then, if you didn't keep it with the cheesecloth on top, or the moisture didn't have a chance to evaporate, you can then kind of put it someplace warm, like in a double boiler crock pot, or back in that yogurt maker with the lid off, and just give that moisture a chance to evaporate out. And that will, you don't have to do that, but that will make your oil last a little bit longer. Another method, especially if you want it to be done in a short span of time, kind of like this one, you don't want to wait 2 weeks. With fresh or dry plant material, you can use a little bit higher heat. You can use a double boiler. I will sometimes use the Little Dipper crock pot that you can get. They're more for appetizers, and they don't get quite as hot as a lot of other cooking apparatus does. And I'll take a mason jar with my oil in it, put that in it, and then pour water around it. And I usually put a thermometer in it just so I know how hot it gets. And usually it gets up to about 125, which is a little hotter than ideal, but not too bad. A lot of our cooking things they start at 200 degrees. And that's really a little bit too hot for oil. It's going to have a tendency to fry your herbs and oxidize your oil, especially if you do it over the course of several hours or several days. So, anything that you can do to kind of bring that heat down a little bit, the yogurt maker or the car on a warm sunny day usually works pretty well. You can make your own double boiler pretty easily by just taking a pan of water and then putting a metal bowl in it, and that's what I use. If you have a real double boiler, then that's great too. I'll have flashed some pictures through here so you can see some of the different techniques for making herbal oils. Another thing that you could do, if you had a fresh plant that's really juicy and watery, and you know that that's going to make it more apt to go bad when it's in the oil, especially as that oil sits for several months, what you can do at that point is you can wilt the herb just a little bit. So you harvest your herb, maybe put it in your basket or something like that, and then put it in a warm spot, but maybe out of direct heat for a couple hours, and just let it kind of wilt down. That'll get off some of the excess moisture, so your plant is still technically fresh, but it doesn't have quite as much moisture. It's a little less apt to go moldy. That's a useful thing to do if you're working with something like lemon balm, which makes a great herbal oil, but it's notorious for going moldy because it's such a juicy plant. But if you work with old dried herb, it's very useless. That doesn't have a lot of the essential oils. So for that, I would either wilt the lemon balm a little bit before I made a fresh herbal oil, or I would dry it, and then as soon as it's done drying, then I would move forward and make my herbal oil. But for dry herbal oils, they're really handy. They do last longer, and they still make pretty good herbal oils. These are best for herbs that don't necessarily need to be fresh to be effective. So gotu kola is a good one for that. Plantain works very well, fresh or dry, doesn't really matter. Calendula works very well, fresh or dry. However, I will say that calendula has a lot of more oil soluble and heat soluble constituents that this method may not get everything out of. So what I often will do with calendula is I do a double method. I will do my blending, and instead of straining it out right away, I'll pour it into a jar, this big slop of oil and alcohol and herb, cover it and let it sit in my warm car for a couple days, or maybe put it in that little double boiler crock pot for a couple hours to a couple days, and I'll just kind of turn the heat on and off periodically to moderate the heat. And I find that technique works the best for calendula, which is one of my favorite herbal oils to use. So you can do a lot of herbs this way. Comfrey works really well this way. Some of the herbs that I would not do with dried herb, the biggie is St. John's wort. St. John's wort definitely makes a better oil if you're working with it fresh, and I usually don't bother wilting it, but it does tend to go bad within a year on me. And other things like cleavers and chickweed, traditionally those are best used fresh, and like I said, the lemon balm, you could use it fresh or freshly wilted or freshly dried would be the two best ways to use it. So those are just a couple to get you started. There are some notes that you can find a lot more about individual herbs and how they're used, and in the next video we're going to make an herbal salve with our herbal oil. So stay tuned.